Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Philanthropy. On today's episode, I have a friend from all the way back in high school and university, and we work together. My lovely friend Trina Forrister is here to join us. Hi, Trina, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. um, I just want to give everybody a little bit of a backstory. So we both worked at EGADS together, and I can't remember what your job was in the nonprofit sector, but I don't even remember the title that for my job. I don't know. I worked with the juvenile delinquents. I think I was
Yeah,
some kind of support worker or something. I'm not really sure. What was your title?
outreach worker.
Worker. Okay. So this topic is about homelessness,
Hmm.
and that's something that I'm really passionate about. Actually, it's interesting because I was thinking that I really wanted to do an episode on homelessness. And it was so fortuitous the way everything happened. My friend Trina was coming over for lunch, and I was at the grocery store, and I saw some homeless individuals. And I remembered sitting in my vehicle and thinking about that, and just really thinking heavily about the issues we have here in Saskatoon and across Canada, and just wondering, what could I do? How could I help with this? Because it's something that really bothers me to my core, and it was something that I had decided maybe a year ago. I was like, at this point in my life, I feel like I should have a cause. I feel like I should have something that I'm pushing towards to better in society. And for me, I realized that homelessness is the issue for me. And of course, feeding people. I think, those kind of go together. But people who are hungry, people who are homeless, this issue really bothers me. So I had been watching these individuals that morning, and then, so it was heavy on my mind. And then Trina came over for lunch. It was weird because it was like heavy in the air. And then all of a sudden, Trina started talking about homelessness. And I was like, what the heck? And we had a really amazing conversation about it. And I said, Trina, please join me and let's talk about homelessness on my podcast. And she said, okay. And I remember distinctly when we had lunch that you had been mentioning the policy changes that you have seen and how detrimental they were to homeless individuals. So, can you share, I guess, even in your experience of work, what you noticed and what has happened since?
So I noticed when they shift the policy from the SAY program to the now it's just, I don't even know what they call it anymore, but they used to pay individuals rent directly to the landlord as well as all bills, utilities directly to the utility companies. And then all of a sudden, the government thought they should shift this and give individuals, um, I guess, access to all the monies that they are allotted for the month without any sort of budgeting program. And it just, a big shift in homelessness started because people who haven't had a lot of money were given large lump sums of cash and expected to be responsible and pay rent and whatnot when they haven't been given the tools to be successful with that. So they were set up to fail, basically. And we've seen a big shift in homelessness on the streets of Saskatoon.
And to me, when I hear that, exactly what you said, you're set up to fail because generally the people who are going to be accessing these types of checks need to have an an address for mail to come to. And
Mm-hmm.
if you have been evicted, if you are unable to suddenly get your mail, then you'll be cut off from benefits because you don't have an address. So it's one of those catch 22s.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Where you need an address to get the benefits, but then also, if you don't have an address, then you don't get benefits. So how are you supposed to get ahead with rent and just the rental economy in Saskatoon? Whereas basic welfare doesn't even cover. I think it's like $460 a month for home for a one person. Whereas just seen today ads for one bedroom apartments were like $1,400. So I don't know. I don't know what the solution would be, but I think uh, like having rent control for one thing. For another thing would be also teaching people how to manage money instead of just expecting people who don't have the tools to manage money to manage the money.
Well, and my thoughts on that, exactly what you said about the rent control is that, again, that's like a cost saving device for the government. If they determine that you're only eligible for this amount of money, compared to the policy before that you mentioned, the say policy, where they would automatically pay your rent, then you might qualify for a larger amount because you don't have any say in the amount of that rent. But if they determine that we're not paying whatever sum of your rent and we're limiting you to a smaller fraction, that's like a very poorly executed cost management strategy on the part of the government, which is really disgusting and leads to a situation like this where we have more people who cannot meet that standard and are forced out of homes.
Yeah, there was a multitude of things that had happened because they also got rid of the rental subsidy program as well, which would top up rent, and that would also be paid directly to the landlords, I believe. And so, Saskatoon, I feel the homeless issue has gotten way out of control, and the provincial government and the municipal governments are not taking things seriously and not, I feel, looking towards the frontline workers for suggestions and ideas on how to help and instead of hinder the problem.
Absolutely. And then when we have these sorts of policy changes, if you look up homelessness initiatives and you're looking at what's going on across the world and across Canada, you might see that we have an allocated budget of this amount of money and it's going towards homelessness. But the reality is, when I look around, a lot of the money is going towards these winter shelters and they're temporary structures. And
Hmm.
if I look at places who have successfully eradicated homelessness, we're looking at places like maybe Finland, and we're looking at places like Japan. They have completely different approaches. And for instance, in Finland, where they have a very successfully reduced homelessness rate, they have permanent dwellings for people to live in. And so your money is going towards structures that people can live in, maybe on a long-term basis, which is a far cry from the encampments we see in Saskatchewan.
Hmm.
And I can't even believe that we have these tent cities and we have temperatures of minus 50. And of course, that's going to raise your mortality rates. There's no way people can, physically survive in a tent in minus 50 in Canada. But even in somewhere like Japan, they have better social networks. And so they say that their homelessness is far reduced because of the community connections. And so then that speaks to how detached we are in Canada
Hmm.
and Canadian society. And a huge part of that, of course, is going to come down to our racial relations, right?
For sure. Yeah, and I believe there was a movement a few years ago that was called Housing First, and I believe that the idea was genuine and good. I just, because all people should have access to housing and food, clothing, basic needs. It shouldn't depend on if they're sober or if you have a job. Canada should be funding homes. And I don't know how you go about that, but you were talking about different places and how they've kind of cured, not cured, but what would the word be?
Attack strategy, I guess.
Attack strategy, like even in the Netherlands, for instance. If you're renting housing, your rent is based on what you make. And once you make a certain amount of money, then you're asked to leave that line of housing and move up to the next interval of housing. So somebody that can only afford that rent can access that house. So it's more like government housing, I guess, whereas we do have low income rental housing, but I don't feel it's run on the same system. And also, I've been reading a lot of the suites are empty because they aren't renting to people because people have bad references or they've had bad experiences in the past. I don't know what the solution is, but I just know my idea would be to have like a wraparound sort of thing where people are not just thrown out on their own, but kind of have a support system and are given the tools to manage money. Maybe if they want access to addiction services, there's access to addiction services, access to healthcare, access to a therapist, like something where the whole community can wrap around these people and just take care of them. Because as you were saying, a lot like racial things happen, and a lot of it comes from like residential schools and how people in society weren't taught how to manage money. It all filters back to when people were taken away from their homes, and we forget that as a society. That like I know this is a really hard topic, and I don't want to step on any toes, but I feel as a society we forgot that the last residential school was just closed in 1995.
Yep.
And so there still is a huge repercussion and um, a lot of teaching that needs to happen and healing before First Nations or Indigenous people can heal from that. And I'm not trying to encompass everybody, but it affects society as a whole. And I don't feel that we've just swept it under the rug. Like we teach it in schools. Yeah, grade 4, you learn about residential schools. But it's kind of, you just sweep it under the rug and pretend like it didn't happen. There's a lot of like addictions and
Yep.
mental health issues, and like how are you supposed to learn how to balance money and pay for housing when you haven't even learned how to manage your anger
Yep.
or been taught like basic things that my mom taught me, like
Yep. Yep.
like not everybody's had that. It's hard to put all these expectations on people when we sometimes you just have to expect that they just need wraparound care
Yep.
and
Yep.
all these programmings offered to them and not have to jump through hoops and be sober and wait for addiction services for a year. And these things need to be accessible now.
100%, my friend. I think you hit the nail on the head when you have identified in this country we have had extreme situations as a result of colonialism and racist
Hmm.
policies. So you're asking somebody who comes from a culture of instability directly as a result of policies that have happened in this country, when we're thinking of things like the residential school, like you identified, the scoop system and the
Hmm.
pass system. We're looking at things that have gone and attacked the fabric of Indigenous society intentionally, right? That was the whole intention, and successfully destabilized so many communities and people who
Hmm.
have suffered and been displaced. And so now we're saying, hey, why are you on the streets? Why are you drunk? And why can't you be just like me? I go to work every day, and maybe I didn't have a perfect life, because that's always what you end up hearing in the comment section. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I have to go to work, and I didn't have a perfect family life and all of these things, but yet your life probably had a whole lot more structure. And here we have a lot of people that are struggling, exactly like you mentioned. They haven't seen stability in the form of a family structure. They haven't seen people often who have had successful experiences with education and on the job front and emotional regulation, exactly like you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're basically trying to survive. And so then we return that with kicking them when they're down, right? And saying, well, why can't you just suck it up and be just like me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly what you mentioned. Yes, many of them have struggled with addictions and probably all forms of abuse. Many people probably need therapy. And then, of course, there are people who have cognitive disabilities. One of my friends had recently said, when there's homeless people, I never give any money to them if they're panhandling, because it's probably just going to go to alcohol or whatnot. And I said, but what about the people who maybe don't have a family support and they have cognitive disabilities, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and so they have nobody to turn to, and they don't even have the same cognitive ability that you have in order to have the structured life that you have. And so, yeah, I mean, I will give money to people sometimes, but actually, I have a funny story. I know I told you I was going to share this
Yeah.
story. It's pretty bad.
Oh,
So
jeez.
I was in Vegas this one time, and my friends were all drinking by the pool. And at that point I was like, I don't feel like drinking by the pool. I'm just gonna go shopping, go wander around. So I was by myself, and I was walking down the strip, and there's, it's a very warm climate, and there were a lot of people that were just kind of sitting on the sides, and they were evidently homeless, and many of them had the signs out for asking for money. And I thought, you know what? I mean, I don't know if money is the solution. I was also, in that line of thinking at the time that maybe I could provide other things instead of money. Maybe I could provide food or water. And, being a little good Samaritan, I walked into one of these little corner shops, and I bought some bananas and I bought some water, and I thought, okay, I'll go around. And at the same time, I thought, these are humans, and, maybe they've had a crappier deal of life than I have at this point. And so I still want to give them dignity, right? I don't want to just like I'm so much better than them and they should be so grateful to me for my generosity. I'll ask them if they want this, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
I went up and I was like, hey, would you like this banana? Would you like a water? And this one man, I remember, he looked me up and down and he's like, do you need a man? And like my jaw hit the ground, right? And I was like, oh my word, and then of course he, began flirting and all of this. And I was like, that's where I learned first and foremost that, people are people first before we put all these
Mm-hmm.
labels on them. I was like, here's a man that is responding to me like a man.
Maybe he wants to go take you on a date
Right?
for banana and water. Just kidding.
Yeah. But and I think that that's kind of the reality, that sometimes we have that us versus them, right?
Mm-hmm.
That these are not people, or they're not at the same level of us. I shouldn't give them the same level of respect because they're not just like me. And of course that's going to go back to our view on people in society. And of course in Canada, our society is so broken as a result of these crappy race relations we have.
Yeah.
And I mean, I just finished doing another podcast on the race relations and how do we work towards repairing those and allyship. But the other day when we had lunch and we were talking about homelessness, you had mentioned that there was some initiative in Calgary that you really liked. Can you share that with the listeners?
Yeah, so when I was doing outreach work in Calgary, they had just opened up the homeless shelter there. And it's a multi-leveled shelter. So basically, level one would be for detox, where you just have mats and whatnot. But then level two would be they would have cots. Level three, as you get higher and higher in the levels, you become more and more responsible because they're giving you the tools for budgeting, for making a resume, that sort of thing. So by the time you reach, I think it was the seventh floor, you had your own room with a shared kitchen facility. But you weren't just tossed in there with $1,500 and say, hey, go have, like, you make it on your own. It was teaching. And
Mm.
I find with these emergency shelters, the people are being asked to leave for 12 hours a day. So, how are you supposed to be productive members of society when you don't have a home for 12 hours out of the day? The daytime would be the perfect time to be providing tools and
Education.
education for people instead of kicking them out on the streets and in the freezing cold.
And then
So,
wondering why our jails are so full of inmates, right? Like there's a
yes.
direct link. I mean, I was thinking about that myself and I was like, if I ended up homeless, and I believe I heard some statistic that we're only two bad decisions away from being homeless, and I don't know if that's true or not, but the reality is we could have a real crappy deal of the cards. And I know for myself, if that was my option, to roam around society and have nowhere to go during the day and maybe have a winter shelter at night, I would probably do a crime so that I at least have my basic needs met in prison. And how is that a better option for people? But then you look at the amount of people in prison, and of course a huge majority of them are Indigenous or probably minorities. And so we have to do something better. So I really love this idea in Calgary. And then something that I was thinking about was, if we look at these disproportionate rates of individuals who are homeless, and a huge chunk are Indigenous, and a huge amount in the prison systems, they're Indigenous. So then I'm thinking of, also, we look at these different, like, on reserve and off reserve,
Mm-hmm.
per bands. Every band has on reserve and off reserve members. And I'm wondering how much money is going towards these bands for housing. And I know it's just very abysmal. Like the amounts that the bands are getting are not very high, but how are they able to then address the amount of people who are in urban centers without a home and they're band members? So then when you mentioned this idea about, Calgary has this multi-tiered structure and different levels require different sorts of supports, wraparound supports. And of course that's building, building a skill set for individuals to be successful and
Mm-hmm.
stand on their own feet. But then I was thinking, for Indigenous people, how about some of that money goes towards the bands for these homelessness shelters that we're building in the city, which, and I'm not saying that they're not a good thing, but it's such a basic level and it's not really reducing the homelessness. And so then if we're thinking, let's reallocate some of this money towards the bands, and maybe the bands can have some kind of urban agreement, because a huge
Mm-hmm.
amount of their on or off reserve populations are in the cities. But if you're from a band, that off reserve people get a very different treatment than on reserve people. And so we need to build some kind of allyship in these urban centers for homelessness with off reserve members. And And something that I was thinking about was there's a band, Thunderchild First Nation here in Sask, and what they did was they purchased, I believe it was maybe a small apartment block, and they purchased it for their university students. So instead of, giving students, a check for X amount and hoping that they're going to be able to survive in a city when we know the cost of living is ridiculous,
Mm-hmm.
they purchased this, and I believe, that of course is going to change the allotment that you're going to give to a student in university, because now they're going to have their rent covered. They're going to have a place to live. And then something that they did was they put in a den mother. So somebody is employed to work there and keep an eye on all the students and see, how the students are doing, and probably help to organize any kind of supports for transportation or medical care or whatnot. So the students aren't left completely unattended. There's that wraparound support, exactly like you identified. And so I'm thinking, how about we see something like this happen in our urban centers, where some kind of collaboration exists between a First Nation, because a lot of the First Nations, they need urban counselors and they don't have it. And this is a huge source of contention on many reserves. And of course, every reserve is a sovereign nation, and so they're going to treat this differently. But for a band, they should have an urban counselor who is able to attend to the needs of their off-reserve population in the urban centers. And so some people, I know this has been in the news, there have been counselors who have been basically kicked off council if they didn't reside on the reserve. They had to live within 100 kilometers of the reserve or something like that. And that's where we need to, on reserves, really start to look at those policies and how they're helping or hindering the membership. But if
Mm-hmm.
they got their act together, then, and they maybe collaborated with the provincial government, or of course, reserves, technically, it's the federal government that they're
Yeah.
dealing with. But if we're looking at urbans, then we should also be including the provincial government, right? And because we have these Indigenous populations in the cities and they're off reserve. So we need to attend to them. And if we were able to do some kind of alliance between these governments and the First Nations, then maybe they could offer a collaboration of these ideas where we take a structure like the one in Calgary with a multi-tiered approach and education and wraparound support encompassing all of that. And we take this idea from Thunderchild where, it's maintained by the First Nation. Then if we had situations like that, then we could work towards permanent housing so that we could see the success rate increase like in Finland. And then we're also maybe working towards that idea of building community, which is what has helped in Japan. I don't know. What are
Mm-hmm.
your thoughts on that?
No, I think that is a really good idea because I mean, most of the treatment facilities in Saskatchewan are seem to be on reserve and run by band members. So why can't we get funding for shelters and homelessness and incorporate what they offer in a recovery center in a housing center? Because I feel a lot of times urban band members get left behind and the urban band offices are not accessible. Like there's never anyone answering the phone, or it's been in my experience anyways.
Hmm.
You go to the office and nobody's there.
When you worked in
So
outreach.
when I worked in outreach, yeah, like taking people that I had supported, they needed help with rent, and so we were trying to get a hold of the band and we could never get a hold of anybody. And so eventually we would just contact the on reserve office and go about it that way. Whereas if we could have somebody that was in the city and that was accessible to help people with their issues that they're having at the moment, because they're also on reserve issues and off reserve issues are totally different as well. So I feel that just having somebody that was accessible and being able to counsel people off reserve. Also, just providing supports for off reserve, and that would include like shelter and basic human needs, which we have all, like, we have seen that First Nations and Indigenous people can provide that support. So why aren't we looking at those resources? I mean, the recovery centers are really successful and run very well. So why are we not giving um, Indigenous peoples the freedom to help with the issue? Because things that we're doing right now, nothing's working, I
Mm,
feel. So
mm,
why don't we try something new?
yeah.
Something that gives people back the power.
I think exactly what you're saying, I'm recognizing that it often becomes a jurisdictional issue, right? And
Hmm.
and if we look at jurisdiction, this is something that spoke directly to the heart of our healthcare system when we think of Jordan's principle. And Jordan's principle was created because of a child who didn't receive health care in time because of a jurisdiction issue, right? They were saying, well, is that a federal issue? He's an Indigenous child. Is it a provincial issue? Is it a First Nation issue? Who is responsible for this child? And time ran out.
Hmm.
And we have the same situation happening with homelessness, where it's becoming is this my problem? Is this your problem? Whose problem is it? It's somebody else's problem. And I think we need to have different forms of strategy to attack this issue. But also, on top of it, it's not just an issue that affects Indigenous people, right? And there is a disproportionate amount of Indigenous people who are homeless, but also there are non-Indigenous people who are homeless. And even some of the brand new immigrants in our country, and maybe they're not able to access supports because of language barriers and cultural differences. And so I do think that having different access is really important for people. I was thinking of, I think it was a TikTok or an Instagram video, and there was a woman featured and she was homeless, and she said homelessness is a challenging situation for her on a day-to-day basis, but the hardest time for her is when she has her period. And when she said that, and being a woman, I was like, oh my God, that really hit home for me, because I had never thought of, if I didn't have access to a shower, if I didn't have access to wash my hands, maybe during the whole entire day, I don't know where I'm going, I need to use the washroom. And I was so floored when I saw that, because it was
Hmm.
something that I had never ever considered, that we have people with different needs who are not being addressed. And so I think that really speaks to the humanity that these people are not experiencing in a first world country. Like, we are, in the world's eyes, Canada is a heaven, but they don't realize that the reality of how some people in our own country are barely surviving from moment to moment.
Just how we aren't treating, like, I was always taught to treat people how you want to be treated. That's not happening. There's fights going on with, I don't want that in my community, I don't want that in my community, but it needs to happen, but I don't want it in my community. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
we need to come together as humans and just be kind and look out
Mm-hmm.
for other people's wellness. It's become very selfish, and like, I just remember as a kid, if your mom would say, if you get lost in the mall, go talk to a stranger and they will help you. And now it's like,
Mm.
don't talk to anybody. Like,
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
scared. Like, your kids, like, that's totally off topic, but it's just the world has changed so much, and we have forgotten that these are people
Yeah.
and they deserve somewhere to live. They also deserve to be treated as a human and not a piece of
Hmm.
garbage that you don't want in your community, because that's just, I don't know, like, it's a huge
Yeah.
topic, and it is really dear and near to my heart, and I feel that as a society we just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Not in my backyard, not in my backyard. Well, it needs to be in somebody's front yard, actually. So
Mm.
we need to stop pushing this to the side and
Yeah.
make it the forefront of issues in Canada that needs to be addressed. Not this,
Hmm.
I don't know, all these other policies and bringing in all these people that need to have more care and stuff, where we need to care for the people that are here. This is my opinion,
Mm.
where we need
Hmm.
to care for the people that are in Canada and the ones that are struggling. Um,
I think that's true, exactly what you're saying. And I think for Indigenous people, and of course I can speak as an Indigenous person, some of the things that people say. And it becomes that scarcity mindset, right?
mhm,
Where as a nation, we definitely want to be supporting people who come from more deplorable situations, from war and famine and whatnot around the world. But you look at our own country and people are not doing so well already, and we're
mhm,
inviting more people to come in. And then you have people like the first people who say, well, so what, now all of this money is going to go to supporting immigrants who just arrived. Meanwhile, we don't even have water in some of the northern First Nations. They have zero
mhm,
access to water, they're barely surviving. And yet the government has decided, I don't know, we want to improve our image and maybe some kind of diplomatic ties with other countries. So we're bringing in all these immigrants and we're not even taking care of our own people to some kind of a standard that really we should be focused on. And so I think exactly what you said, like, I love what you said, that we need to be making this issue in our front yard. It can't be pushed to the side. We have to stop looking at us versus them and turning a blind eye and then just looking out for ourselves and not
mhm,
and recognizing that people around us could be sleeping on the ground tonight and wake up dead tomorrow because we
mhm,
turned a blind eye. And that's on us as a society. And I know some people will say, oh, that's on our government. Well, what about us too? Right? Exactly like what you said, where we used to have situations where we could look out for people and we could recognize that there was safety in the community. If we needed help, we could get it. And that's not the state in Canada. That's not been the experience for many people in this country.
yes, you said it perfectly. We just need to go back to not the olden days for everything, but like, there's values that have been misplaced. There's just human decency that has been
Yeah,
misplaced.
that's right.
Society as a whole
Well,
needs to take accountability and
mm-hmm.
not just put this on someone else, because no
Right.
one else is dealing with this issue.
Yep, exactly. And so it becomes one of those, what are you doing? Right? What
Yeah.
are you doing to change this? And I think for me, that was like, I need to get together with people. I need to start having those conversations. If it means, working towards fundraising, if it means, working towards pushing our government to make some better choices, then I think that's what we got to do, right? We got to turn on that switch in our heads, in our hearts
Hmm.
for awareness and be better humans, right?
And I think just even having those difficult conversations
Yeah.
and bringing things to light, like, not just sweeping things under the rug. because that hasn't worked in the past, so it's not going to work now. So we just
Mm-hmm.
need to come up with, I don't know what to come up with, but I think just having community discussions and discussions with your friends, discussions
Yeah.
with your neighbors,
Yep.
and just expressing your viewpoints and just, yeah, like I said, treating people like people instead of a piece of garbage.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think you're so brilliant, my friend. Thank you so much for bravely sitting down and having this topic with me. You know, it is a topic that's near and dear to my heart also. And I love your advice that, you know, we need to become aware, we need to become more informed, we need to have conversations with people around us and start becoming involved, taking some action, right? And so I hope people start by listening to this podcast, and I hope it stirs something in them and, you know, and maybe inspires them towards action. But I am so grateful to you, beautiful lady, for sharing your thoughts today about homelessness. It has meant the world to me. I appreciate you. Thank
Oh,
you so
well,
much.
thank you for having me.
You're an angel. And thank you so much for your time and energy. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope our listeners have a wonderful day too. Bye.
Bye.